Hey everybody, this is Chris coming to you live from the library on behalf of Cinephellas, the only website, wait for it, for all your cinephilic needs. And no, I do not particularly want to go down to the basement with you, nor do I want to sniff some glue. But thank you so much for asking. On this edition of Chris's Classics, we'll be taking a look at the Ramones film debut, Rock and Roll High School. You might have guessed that today's episode had something to do with the Ramones by our decor back there. But what's really interesting about this episode is it's also incredibly timely. This is the 40th anniversary of the Ramones' first album release. So their first self-titled album was released in 1976. Can you believe that they've been gracing our ears for that long? And in conjunction with that anniversary, there's also a new museum exhibition that just opened up here at the Grammy Museum in Los Angeles called Hey Ho, Let's Go, Ramones and the Birth of Punk. The exhibit was first at the Queens Museum in New York, Queens, New York, of course, being the Ramones' hometown. It was there earlier this year, and it just opened a few weeks ago. It's on display at the Grammy Museum in downtown Los Angeles until February 28th. The film was released in 1979. It was directed by Allan Arkush with help from Dante. The screenplay was by Richard Whitley, Russ, Dvonch, and Joseph McBride. The story itself was by Allan Arkush and Dante, and it stars PJ Soles as Riff Randall. You might recognize PJ from other early 80s films like Stripes with Bill Murray. Vince Van Patten also stars in the film as Tom. Dee Young stars as Riff's best friend Kate. Clint Howard is Eaglebauer, and Mary Woronov is the antagonist principal, Miss Evelyn Togar. And of course, the Ramones are in the film as well. They don't really make an appearance until about 1/3 into the film, about 37 minutes or so, but you do get a really clear look at their vibe. They're very standoffish in a way that it's very cool and calm and collected. So I found out some really interesting facts about the film when I was researching. Producer Roger Corman wanted to make an homage to teenage musicals from the start, but the working titles were very different. At first it was going to be called Disco High, then it was going to be called Heavy Metal Kids, and then Girls Gym. Those were the three working titles. And Corman also wanted Cheap Trick or Todd Rundgren to star in it. And it's interesting, Todd Rundgren, his song A Dream Goes On Forever does make it onto the soundtrack of Rock and Roll High School. But because of scheduling conflicts, Rundgren and Cheap Trick were unable to appear in the film. The story itself is based on a real-life situation that happened in the 1920s at Superior, Wisconsin Central High School. The Ramones actually got their name from a pseudonym that Paul McCartney used to use in the late kind of 50s, early 60s, when the Beatles were known as the Silver Beatles, and instead of being spelled B-E-A-T-L-E-S as they became famous, the Silver Beatles spelled B-E-E-T-L-E-S. And Paul was kind of playing around with monikers at the time, and he used to use the pseudonym Phil Ramone. Dee Dee was the first one to pick up on that, and he changed his last name to Ramone, and then the others followed in a show of unity, and that same sense of unity is where we get the leather jackets, the ripped jeans, the Converse, and all that. And in the mid-1970s, as I said, the Ramones become part of the CBGB scene. That CBGB is founded by Hilly Crystal, not to be confused with the great Billy Crystal of When Harry Met Sally fame and SNL fame and several other things. This is Hilly Crystal, and he opened CBGB with one rule, and it's that you had to come as a band and play your own original music. The CBGB stood for Country, Bluegrass, Blues, and that's originally what he had intended for the bands to play. But it just so happened that the club was opening up at the same time that all these new bands were coming together, and this artistic and creative revolution was starting. So the Ramones started playing there with bands like Television, the Patti Smith Group, and several others, Blondie, Talking Heads. So the museum exhibition goes into a discussion not only of the Ramones, but also what is punk rock. I mean, now in 2016 we have all of these ideas about what we think punk is, and everybody has their sort of own associations. But in the mid-70s, it was developing simultaneously in New York City and London, and very different. For instance, the London bands were more political. Think about a song like the Sex Pistols' God Save the Queen, which was a very sarcastic statement against the monarchy, while the bands in New York were writing more about everyday life, right? The Ramones, one of the reasons they became so popular is because they were one of the first bands to sort of come right off the street in just their regular gear and play, and it lended a different sense of authenticity to the music they were making. And in America at that time it was very important because the music that was coming out was very bloated, progressive rock. Think here of Emerson, Lake and Palmer, think of Yes, right, where you have these sometimes 20-30 minute songs with big orchestral passages. I mean, they were very influenced by classical music. The punk bands from New York City kind of come out and say, well, we want to create music that harkens back to the 50s and the 60s. So early Chuck Berry, Beach Boys, the Ronettes, right, the girl groups of the 60s. And I think that that kind of complexity really shows itself on the soundtrack to Rock and Roll High School. So there are several Ramones tracks, both in the film, and some of them didn't make it onto the proper soundtrack. But in the film, they feature songs Blitzkrieg Bop, of course, the classic, I Want You Around, Questioningly, which is one of my favorite Ramones songs that kind of flies under the radar, and Sheena's a Punk Rocker. And I mean, of course, every time you hear that song, you have to just pump your fist, or you have to get a little bit sweaty inside, because that is a great song. But it also features a lot of songs, the soundtrack does, and the movie itself features a lot of songs by artists from the 50s, 60s, and 70s, which you might not at first associate with the Ramones. And by doing this, by structuring the film with these songs, they give you further insight into not only their influences, but also how the Ramones themselves built their sound. So for instance, we do have a Chuck Berry song in there. We have Rock and Roll, the song by the Velvet Underground from Loaded, the very last studio album that came out with Lou Reed from 1970. We have Brownsville Station, their classic Smokin' in the Boys' Room, which was kind of like a glam-ish rock song from the early 70s. There are several Brian Eno tracks, both his ambient work, and that's more atmospheric, and a few of his new wavy type songs. A Nick Lowe song called And So It Goes, which is a really great song. Then Paul McCartney. And so it's interesting, very intelligent, that it's a very rare Paul McCartney song, and forgive me, I cannot even remember what the title of it is, but it's a very obscure Paul McCartney song from his solo years that they use in Rock and Roll High School, and it's this really nice, subtle way to let the viewer know, at least on a subconscious level, that Paul McCartney was so inspirational to the kind of founding of the Ramones, and when you realize that they named themselves after Paul's pseudonym, the fact that he's included with all of these other, kind of like punk and new wave songs, it's really fascinating. The making of Rock and Roll High School comes at a really interesting moment in the Ramones' career. At the same time that they're making this movie, they're also recording End of the Century with Phil Spector. And of course, right, we saw how Phil Spector's big pop sound that was called the Wall of Sound, which he used when he created songs like Be My Baby for the Ronettes. He offered to produce End of the Century with the Ramones. And this was incredibly appealing, especially to Joey, who always had a real pop sensibility. And this was part of a greater move towards commercial success, because by 1979, 1980, a lot of the other first wave punk bands, Blondie, Talking Heads, right? They all went on and became new wave and very mainstream successful artists. And the Ramones, they had that appeal, they had that ability, but for whatever reason, they just weren't breaking through, especially in the United States. So this movie, this Rock and Roll High School, which recalls the kind of 50s and 60s teen rock musicals, specifically I think of like Beach Blanket Bingo, right? Like the surf rock song, musicals about teenage culture from the early 60s. You get a sense here that between recording with Phil Spector on End of the Century and doing this movie, that it's one last grab at trying to find that mainstream success. And we should note too here that by this point, when the movie comes out, Tommy Ramone has left the band. He was producing still with the Ramones up until End of the Century, and then Marky Ramone comes over and he takes over on drums. Now, we should note too, unfortunately, we've lost all 4 of the original members, and Marky at this point is kind of like the flag bearer of the band. Here I'll put up some of the images that I took when I was there. There are handwritten lyric sheets, which are really cool, and some of them have different lyrics than the final versions of the songs. Some musical instruments, guitars for instance. One of the coolest things for me was at the very end, right when you're leaving, they have Marky's drum set up, as it would have appeared on stage about the time that Rock and Roll High School came out. And of course, the leather jackets and ripped jeans that we talked about are there. Original album cover pressing, so like hot off the presses when Sire Records, the Ramones record company in the late 70s, was releasing these albums. We have them, sort of the original sleeves there, which are pretty cool because, sometimes when albums are reissued, especially on CD, they might have different covers or, just be changed a little bit. But it's cool to see the originals. It also comes at a time in the late 1970s, mid to late 70s, where there's a wave of nostalgia across the United States in terms of culture. So case in point, think of a show like Happy Days, right, which is set in the 70s, but it fondly looks back at the 1950s as this very placid, happy time. Yes, they do mention things like nuclear fallout shelters. There's a very famous episode of Happy Days where Mr. Cunningham buys a bomb shelter. But overall, the 50s are a pretty safe time. There's very little mention of the things like the Korean War, general anxiety over nuclear annihilation other than the bomb shelter. It's all about just hanging out with your friends, going to school, and your biggest concern is, how to sort of get over on the teacher. And all of these sensibilities are wrapped up in Rock and Roll High School. And it's interesting too that the film, though it comes out in 1979, is set in 1980. So it was almost like a sense of wishful thinking on the part of the Ramones to suggest that they were, beginning a new era themselves, but also that in some way they were looking back to start again and maybe be kind of the forerunner of this new culture that was happening. The film gives us a really cool look at the Ramones as comedians, right? And we don't really think about that, but we have to remember that not only was 50s and 60s music really important to the Ramones, but comics, early 20th century comedy in general, so comic books and comedies were very important to them and kind of giving them the sense of humor of songs like Beat on the Brat, for instance. And it was really cool at the exhibit. They had some of the band's shirts, t-shirts that they wore just sort of early in life and then on stage later. And I'll throw one up here, well, 2 actually. So this first one is a buckwheat shirt that they wore, and then the second one is Uncle Floyd. And I remember my biological father was a very big fan of Uncle Floyd. And a lot of you might not know him. He had this sort of weird children's entertainment variety type show in the local New York area. And in the film, there are two scenes that kind of show the Ramones embracing that kind of comedy and, putting it back into the viewer, like kind of regurgitating what they picked up. So, so the first one is when Riff is in her bedroom and she's smoking and she turns on I Want You Around, the Ramones song. And she starts fantasizing about the Ramones, and specifically Joey, right? She has a big crush on Joey. So she's laying there on her bed, and she starts imagining that the band is in the room with her. And so Joey comes in, and he climbs on her on the bed, and he sort of mounts her, and gets very intense, and he's singing this love song to her. And then the camera pans over, and Johnny is just awkwardly sitting in a chair, strumming along on the guitar. And then next to him, they cut to... Riff looks out the window and Marky is just on the lawn, just kind of drumming along, And then the best part for me was when they walk into the bathroom and they push the curtain aside of the shower curtain, and then Dee Dee is just standing there under the faucet playing Soaking Wet. And then another very slapsticky kind of scene, which for me triggered specifically the Three Stooges, a little bit of the Marx Brothers as well, was when Riff finally gets the chance to give her songs to Joey at a concert venue, and the manager, he basically says, you shouldn't be in here, blah, blah, blah. Then she goes to eat pizza with the other guys, so the other three Ramones, and then the manager starts to feed Joey wheat germ. And it's this thing where he's just like shoving it in his mouth, right? Very, very physical, very slapsticky, a la the Three Stooges and the Marx Brothers. And if the Ramones ever were going to have a chance to become pop stars, it would have been with the songs on Rock and Roll High School and End of the Century. After the film and after that album, they kind of embrace being underground legends, and they make great music, and it does have a very brilliant mainstream sensibility, but unfortunately it just never catches on the way that it should. So we can look at Rock and Roll High School as a sort of pinnacle in terms of their career, but we can also look at it as a moment where, after making this film, the band realizes, who they really are as artists. So for them, it's a very self-actualizing experience. And so for that reason, I give this film 3.5 out of 5 hair pieces. If you have a chance to see the exhibit, as I said, it's on display until February 28th, 2017. So maybe you're saving up some money, maybe you want to travel to sunny Los Angeles. It's not the utopia that people say it is in the romanticized world, but it's pretty cool. So if you have a chance to come out, definitely stop by the Ramones exhibition. It's called Hey Ho, Let's Go, and it's there until February 2017. But the real takeaway from Rock and Roll High School, though, that I think you'll see and that I really love, is that it exhibits the Ramones' passion. So in a very climactic scene, the band plays at Vince Lombardi High, and you get a sense, very visually, what people were attracted to when it came to the Ramones. So that being said, we're going to fade in with some music right now, and I want to leave you with a clip of that performance. So this is Chris. Thanks for joining us on this edition of Chris's Classics for Cinephellas, and we'll see you next time.
Rock, 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 rock.
Ramones are peculiar. They're ugly.